Nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to this monthly presentation by the New Zealand Society of Genealogists. So tonight I have the great pleasure of introducing Elena Fowler, who is here to talk us about DNA. So I'm going to pass straight over to Elena and let her tell us more. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Tēnā koutou katoa ki te rōpū, ko hui hui mai ki konei, hei whakanui ki tēnei kaupapa whakahirira, te rangahau whakapapa. Tai ana ki ngā hua o te whakamātautau pītau ira. Ka nui te mihi ki ngā mana whenua koutou ko nai iwi o te motu katoa. Ka mihi. Thank you all for taking time to join me for this talk, Whakanuia te whanaungatanga, using DNA test results to connect with whānau and whakapapa. Thank you to the NZSG for inviting me to speak this evening. I'm humbled to be here to share some of what my whānau and I, and others who are on this learning journey with us, have learned from DNA testing. I hope this talk assists those of you who have already DNA tested to get more out of your DNA test results. And for those who haven't DNA tested, I hope it will pique or go some way towards filling your interest to learn more about how DNA testing can complement your whakapapa research. If you've attended or watched online my previous talks, you'll see there's some overlap with today's presentation. As part of this whakatakinga, I'd like to acknowledge our many tupuna who we carry in our hearts, minds and bodies. I'd particularly like to acknowledge the tupuna and their uri, the ancestors and their descendants who didn't and perhaps still don't know their whānau, hapu or iwi, including my tupuna wahine Zelda, photographed outside her home in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland, in the early 1900s, aged about 65 years old. Zelda was born in the early 1840s in Kororareka, Bay of Islands. I don't know for certain, but Zelda may have been one of the earliest tamariki Māori in Tāmaki Makaurau to grow up in their maternal Pākehā family with no knowledge of their Māori father, nor his whānau, hapu or iwi. One thing the descendants of Zelda do know is that we are uri Māori. In this photo are 4 of Zelda's mokopuna, my great-grandmother Winifred on the far left, and 3 of Winifred's 4 siblings. Not everyone who is Māori knows they are Māori. Many people are discovering they are Māori after DNA testing. And some people, because of the way the DNA test results are presented, think that they're Māori, even though they're not. In terms of Māori, I'm meaning tangata whenua. So there are also people who know they are tangata whenua, but they don't know their whānau or whakapapa. This loss of whakapapa and whānau connections are some of the main reasons that tangata whenua have DNA tested, our whānau included. Before I go further, there are a couple of things I want to emphasise that this talk is not about. I'm not wanting in any way to push DNA testing on anyone as a way to prove your tangata whenua. Although for those who aren't sure if they're Māori or not due to disconnections, DNA testing may be able to help provide evidence that you have tupuna Māori, you whakapapa Māori, you are Māori. This talk also isn't about privileging DNA testing over going back to your marae and learning about your whakapapa from kuia and kaumātua and other whānau members if that is an option for you. However, if you don't know your whānau or whakapapa and you can't identify them, and therefore you don't know your marae, then DNA testing may be your only option to find this out. This talk is also not about convincing people to DNA test. DNA testing is problematic for many reasons, particularly for tangata whenua and other Indigenous peoples, and I acknowledge this. Nor is this talk about supporting beliefs or theories based on blood quantum. I also want to acknowledge that many of the English language terms used in genealogy, history and geography, anthropology and other disciplines, such as the different terms for relationships, e.g. second cousins, cousins once removed, half aunts, the terms Māori, tangata whenua, Aotearoa, Polynesia, Polynesian, Pacific, the concepts of ethnicity estimates, and of course percentages, are contested and have a problematic history. These are all understandably important issues, but I won't be discussing them further today in this talk. However, because DNA testing companies use this language in the reports that they give us, we want to be able to understand, and because we want to be able to understand our test results, I will be using some of these terms because they're well known, because the DNA testing companies use them, and because we don't have good alternatives that are as equally well known and understood. So what are we going to be talking about today in this talk? Well, we're going to be looking at using DNA testing as a tool for whanaungatanga, making connections, both with whānau and with whakapapa. So DNA test results can help us to make these connections with our Māori and non-Māori whanaunga, tupuna, and we can learn more about ourselves and our whakapapa, including our migration stories and connections across Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, the Pacific, and beyond. So that's the kaupapa of this talk, and let's get into it. Today I'm going to give you an overview of DNA and how inheritance works. Next up, we're going to look at how DNA testing companies such as Ancestry and MyHeritage build your match list, and why using this information to work out how you're related to your Māori DNA matches and others from across the moana can be extra challenging. Next, we're going to look at some of the things we can do despite the challenges. And lastly, where to learn more. So first up, DNA. DNA is inside the cells in our body. It operates a bit like an instruction manual for building and operating us. More than 99% of our DNA is exactly the same as every other person's DNA. That's what makes us all tangata. Less than 1% is different. It makes you, you, and me. DNA testing companies such as Ancestry, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and 23andMe aim to sample the areas of DNA where we are different, unless of course we're recently related. The DNA these companies test is called autosomal DNA. And Family Tree DNA does also offer Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA testing, and I'm going to be giving a little bit of info about them towards the end of the talk. But mainly the DNA that's tested is autosomal DNA. Autosomal DNA is pretty special. When we test this type of DNA, we can learn about both our father's and our mother's ancestral lineages. You get 50% of your autosomal DNA from each parent. Your biological mum and dad didn't create that autosomal DNA that they gave you, however. They inherited it from their parents, he taonga tuku iho. The autosomal DNA that your mum and dad passed on to you is actually just half of the autosomal DNA that they inherited. So what this means is you got about 25% of your autosomal DNA from each of your grandparents, and around about 12.5% from each great-grandparent, about 6% from each great-great-grandparent, and so on, all the way back to your 64 great-great-great-great-grandparents, that almost invisible row of tupuna at the top of this chart. From those ancestors in the back row of this whakapapa, you'll have inherited at least a tiny bit of DNA, around about 1.5%, from most, if not all of them. If we look at the whakapapa chart here, we can see that the amount of autosomal DNA you inherit from each tupuna halves on average every time we step back a row or generation. And this is how all of us inherit our autosomal DNA. Even though you and these ancestors other uri will have inherited autosomal DNA from all or almost all of these tupuna, you and the other descendants won't all share autosomal DNA with each other, because you've inherited different parts of the ancestors' autosomal DNA. We're going to look now at how much DNA we're likely to share with the other descendants of our tupuna. It's important to look at this info because most of our autosomal DNA matches will be descendants of our shared tupuna and not the actual tupuna themselves. Oops, sorry. If we look at two mokopuna, they will share on average about 25% of their DNA with each grandparent, as we saw previously. But between themselves, they will only share about 12.5% of their DNA, assuming that they're recently related through only one set of grandparents. Now, if you test your DNA and you see that you share about 12.5% of your DNA with a match, the DNA testing company will have used this info to predict you might be first cousins. But it isn't just first cousins who share about 12.5% of their DNA with each other. Great-grandparents will also share about this much DNA with you, as we saw earlier. Your parents' brothers and sisters who only share one parent, sometimes referred to as half-uncles or half-aunts, will also share about 12.5% of their DNA with you. Your grandparents' brothers and sisters, sometimes referred to as great-uncles and great-aunts, will also share about 12.5% of their DNA with you. All of these relationships are possible when you share 12.5% DNA with a match, and there are other ones as well. Now, some DNA testing companies do use the ages of the tester and match to attempt to narrow down the possible options, and some DNA testing companies also take into consideration how many pieces or segments of DNA that total DNA is shared across. But the main thing to remember is that the DNA testing companies can't tell you exactly what the relationship is between a tester and a match. They can only give you a prediction, an estimate, an educated guess based on how much DNA you share. To know more precisely how you're related to a match, you need to bring in whakapapa, or genealogy research, and you often need to ask others to DNA test. Let's look at some other relationships now and the typical amount of DNA shared if a tester and match only descend from one recent ancestral couple. Here, the most recent shared ancestral couple are great-grandparents. Their great-grandchildren will share about 12.5% of their DNA, but only about 3% with each other. If you share about 3% of your DNA with a match, the DNA testing companies will use this info to predict you might be second cousins, but there are other possible relationships, including half-first cousins. That's cousins who share only one grandparent, and first cousins once removed. That can be either your parents' first cousins or the children of your first cousins. You might refer to them as your nieces or nephews if they're the children of your first cousins, and your parents' first cousins you may refer to as your uncles and aunties. But in terms of genealogy software and the DNA testing companies, there are different relationship terms which are used. So as the amount of shared DNA drops, more and more different relationships become possible, so it becomes more challenging to know exactly how you are related to a match. Let's move another generation away here and look at great-grandchildren, who will share about 6% with their great-great-grandparents, but only about 1% with each other. And they may not, in fact, share any DNA with each other. About 10% of third cousins won't share any DNA with each other. Now, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but I've tried to visually represent here with this family series that both the segments or blocks of DNA inherited from one's ancestors and those shared with the descendants get smaller and smaller as more generations pass between the testers and the original shared ancestors. At third cousin level, we typically start to come up against the limitations of using autosomal DNA test results for genealogical research. We're typically sharing smaller and smaller pieces of DNA with our matches, and it becomes hard to know if the shared DNA is coming from known ancestors, such as the great-great-grandparents at the top of this chart, or whether some of it, or even all of it, is perhaps coming from more distant ancestors on other lines, and these could be known or unknown. If we take a further step to shared ancestors one more generation back to great-great-great-grandparents, great-great-great-grandchildren will share about 3% of their DNA with the great-great-great-grandparents, but about half of fourth cousins, that's the descendants in the same generation, will not share any DNA with each other. And even if they do share DNA, it could be quite a small amount. Again, it will be harder to know for certain if that shared DNA is from their known great-great-great-grandparents or known and or unknown ancestors much further back in time on other lines, potentially more than one set. Now, if you're related to a match through many different ancestors and or the same ancestors in several different ways, you may end up sharing more DNA than what is expected given the most recent known ancestors, shown here in the right-hand corner. So to summarise thus far, DNA is inherited in a predictable pattern. From our tupuna, it's inherited in a predictable pattern from our tupuna. DNA test results enable us to connect with matches, but the relationships DNA testing companies give us are always estimates. And that's true even for parent-child relationships, as there's always the chance that a parent could have had an identical twin who would also show as the parent of the child of their identical twin. So a niece or nephew of an identical twin would show as their own child. Now, the estimated relationships, as I said, are based mostly on the total amount of DNA shared and are across the different companies are most commonly shown as a percentage. But they also are shown sometimes as a centimorgan, it's abbreviated as a small c and a capital M. The smaller the amount of DNA shared with a match, the greater the number of possible relationships. It's usually easiest to work out how you're related to a recently related match, those descending from your great-grandparents or closer. That's back to this generation. These matches will typically share at least a few and often many large segments of DNA. Sharing multiple long segments of DNA with a match is what gives us confidence that we share a recent common ancestor, and also the total. We can look at another representation of these recently related relatives who are pretty much guaranteed to share DNA with you. Now, with all of these whanaunga, you will usually share quite a lot of DNA, and you'll usually share at least a few and sometimes many good long segments of DNA. That's blocks of DNA that are 30 centimorgans or longer. If you can research your whakapapa, you should be able to work out with a good deal of confidence where genuine, not just predicted, DNA matches from these generations fit in, even if you don't already know who they are. Now, I've greyed out the boxes here, where in this bottom right-hand corner, for the whanaunga, where you start sharing only quite small pieces of DNA, and where there is the possibility of not sharing any DNA at all. Let's look now at those relatives. They descend from tupuna a bit further back in our whakapapa. That's these ones above the line. Now, although most people will share DNA with their 4 times and closer great-grandparents, you're less and less likely to share DNA with their descendants, particularly those who sit at a younger generation than yourself, unless you're related in multiple different ways. Sharing only small segments of DNA with a match is no guarantee by itself that the DNA comes from the known shared ancestors, assuming you know who they actually are. Small segments of DNA could equally have come from more distant or unknown tupuna on other lines, perhaps 7 or 10 or even 20 to 30 generations back in time, well beyond what most people know of their whakapapa on all lineages. Some of us are fortunate to know quite far back on some lines, but usually not on all lines. So to sum up, it gets a lot harder for all testers to work out how they're related to their matches the further back in time the shared ancestors are, because you're typically only sharing small segments of DNA, and there's more and more different ways that you could also be related that you may not know about. And we can look again at this cousin chart, and this time the matches where you're guaranteed to share DNA and almost definitely will have some decent long segments of DNA. These ones are grayed out, and here highlighted are the matches, the known relatives where you start to share smaller and smaller amounts of DNA. So just another recap, sharing multiple large segments of DNA with a match is good evidence of sharing recent ancestors. and sharing only small segments with a match, even if it's quite a lot of small segments added up to a decent total, isn't great supporting evidence by itself of sharing recent or known traceable ancestors. And even though the relationships are estimated, and you may not know your matches, the DNA matches identified when you DNA test may be recently related to you. Check the segment length. And if they're sharing multiple long segments, then those matches may help support and extend your whakapapa research. Thus, the DNA test results have enabled you to connect with your whānau and your whakapapa. So assuming your whānau came from or have lived for at least a few generations in a community where DNA testing is pretty popular, like Aotearoa, you're likely to be able to use your DNA test results as a good source of information to verify your whakapapa back at least about 3 generations, and possibly further back for lineages which have British Isle ancestors, because there are other tools that you can use, and we're going to look briefly at that. It does get harder to use autosomal DNA test results as supporting evidence of sharing specific ancestors the further back you go, and that's for all DNA testers, but there's particular impacts for those of us with whakapapa Māori lineages, and we're going to look more in detail as to why that is shortly. So another important thing to know when using DNA test results for genealogy is that DNA testing companies assume that you have a whakapapa that looks like this, where each ancestral line goes back to a different, unrelated ancestor, and where you can separate and isolate out groups or clusters of shared matches, that's matches who share DNA with you, the tester, and with each other, and who are connected to you through just one great-grandparent line. Now, these clusters of matches could be visually mapped against your whakapapa, like this. So where each coloured box there indicates that a match who is related to you through that great-grandparent and the shared matches are all related to you somewhere through that great-grandparent's ancestors. And you may have heard the term the leads method if you've already DNA tested. And, you know, that's one popular term that refers to this method of grouping your matches based on who shares DNA, who your matches share with each other. So just to restate, grouping shared matches in this way is a useful step to follow if your tree looks like this. And not just at this distance, you know, not just at fourth great-grandparent level, but ideally further back as well. However, if you come from a community that not too long ago had a fairly small population and was fairly isolated in some way for a decent amount of time, including any island in Te Moananui-a-Kiwa, plus many other regions in the world, and in fact, all regions in the world once we get back around 300 or 400 years ago, pre-industrialization, they were typically rural communities, just a small founding population, and the communities were tended to be isolated, and that was the case here in Aotearoa as well. And what happens then is that people are related to their ancestors and each other in more than one way, and you may have a whakapapa that looks something more like this, where instead of having 64 different great-great-great-great-grandparents, you may only have 52. And as I said, we all have interwoven family trees like this as we go back further in time. It's not at all the same thing as incest, and it's nothing to be shameful of. In terms of our DNA test results, we don't all see the impact of this history of intermarriage in our families in our DNA test results today. It depends really on how many of your great-grandparents you have from the same community and how small and isolated the community has been in the past. So you can see in this chart some of the different ways the hypothetical testers tupuna are related to each other. The testers' paternal grandparents are third cousins to each other in 2 different ways, and the maternal grandparents are third cousins to each other in 3 different ways. and the tester's parents are themselves related to each other in 2 different ways. Now, if a tester and a match and a shared match all came from the same smallish community and all descend from their ancestors in multiple different ways, you're likely to share a lot more DNA than expected with your match and the shared match, because you've all inherited more DNA from a smaller number of ancestors, and because you're all related in more than one way to each other. Now, in these circumstances, interpreting DNA test results becomes very difficult. If we take, for example, the 4th cousin matches sharing small amounts of DNA from additional shared ancestors, this becomes more and more likely when you come from a small founding community. And in this example, the 4th cousins are now sharing 10 times as much DNA as what would be expected if they only descended from that one recent ancestral couple and they weren't also descended from other ancestors from that same smallish community. So returning to this example, if we would try to use the standard research methods of grouping shared matches and mapping the results against a tree, we'd get results something like this. So instead of having 8 different groups or clusters, we have 2, and it's entirely possible that those two, if there was, if these ancestors came from the same small community, then in the generations further back, they'd also be related. And in fact, with shared matches, would pretty much just get one giant shared match. And if you're familiar with MyHeritage, there is an option to run an auto cluster there, and it might look something like this for you. With an auto cluster, each coloured square means a match of yours is also a match with another match of yours. And so in the red square, everyone with a small red square is related to another person in that group. And in this example, the tester has only one Māori great-great-grandparent. And yet they have all these Māori matches. The matches in the orange square, they are in the orange group, they are also Māori, and the matches in the yellow. And they just have a few of their non-Māori matches in that green group. So, of course, this is just a small snapshot of some of their matches. They have many thousands more. So the main workaround when you're trying to understand your DNA test results, if they are impacted from this history of endogamy, is to look at the matches who share multiple long segments of DNA with you. We already know that these are the matches who are most likely to be recently related to you, and that's the case regardless of your your genealogical history. This holds true. Matches who are recently related will share long segments of DNA with you. The more Māori great-great-grandparents you have, the more matches you'll have who will only share relatively small segments of DNA and are related to you further back in time. Now, due to time constraints tonight, I'm not going to go into the details of how to find what I refer to as priority matches at the different DNA testing companies, but I have created a series of talks that step you through how to do that. And they're available for free on YouTube, and there's also 3 talks still available online at Roots Tech. So to summarise where we've got to so far in the talk, we've been looking at the challenges for Māori DNA testers and the history of coming from small founding communities where our tupuna were related in multiple ways. And, the fancy term that's used often for this is endogamy. The other thing we've looked at is that because DNA testing companies don't expect us to have these kind of whakapapa, and they can't really take good account of it in the relationship predictions, nor in the shared matches of features and other clustering tools, we need to use workarounds. And the main ones for those are looking at segment length. And also, if you check out the videos, I discuss the importance of looking at average segment as well. And it's also really important to avoid using the shared matches feature with matches who are Māori, or in fact who have any percentage of, depending on the different company, it might be referred to as Hawaii or Polynesian or Polynesia. At 23andMe, Filipino and Austronesian, Melanesian, Tonga and Samoa at Ancestry as well. If a match has any of that percentage, it's generally wisest to avoid using the shared matches feature. If you do want to use it, definitely use it with caution. And but it's still a good feature to use with matches who don't have any of that percentage. Previously, as I referred to, Māori, Samoa, Tonga, Hawaii, Polynesia, Polynesian, just depending on the DNA testing company, what reference groups they have. Even when you're using it with matches who don't have any of that percentage, you still need to exercise caution, particularly at MyHeritage, which doesn't typically, if you have fewer than 2 Māori great-grandparents or 2 Polynesian great-grandparents, you won't register a percentage of Polynesian, and neither will your matches. So you may think that a match doesn't have a shared ancestor from the moana, but it's possible that they do. So check out the genetic groups at MyHeritage as well, because they typically are better at identifying whether a tester is Māori or comes from the moana. So yeah, exercise caution with shared matches. Next up, we're going to look at another kind of workaround. We're going to look at Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA and what they offer us. So, te hiri tāne, Y-DNA. Y-DNA tests focus on one line only, the father's father, etc. line. And so what this means is if you have matches on a Y-DNA test result, you can be sure that there's a shared ancestor somewhere, sometime on that patrilineal line. And that can be so helpful. You're not needing to try to work out which line they're on, as you will be with your autosomal matches. So this unique inheritance path, which is sometimes thought of as being a limitation, can be a strength. So if there's you and you know, or maybe perhaps you don't know your direct paternal lineage, when you have matches, there has to be a shared ancestor somewhere, sometime. Now, you may, of course, also have shared ancestors on other lines as well. And so it can still be hard to know, well, who is the shared ancestor, how far back in time did they live, and what we have now, or we've had for a few years now, but the database is increasing, so it's increasingly helpful, is the Big Y test results at Family Tree DNA. These allow us to see a mapped out genetic family tree of all men who've Y-DNA tested. And we can work out approximate dates of when they shared ancestors with each other. So this is just a simplification of how Big Y or Y-DNA testing works. And I'm going to show you some results further on. This genetic tree of all men is currently growing exponentially as more and more men Y-DNA test, and it is referred to as the Y-DNA haplotree. The small changes or SNP that happen on average every few generations as the Y-DNA is passed down can be tracked and used to create this haplotree, literally a tree of mankind. So the entry-level test that you can do at Family Tree DNA, the Y37, that will give you test results which do enable the tester to know their genetic lineage right back to genetic Adam in Africa, who lived around about 200,000 years ago. It doesn't give you great precision, but a Big Y test will. And I'm just going to show you some screenshots from the Y-DNA time tree at Family Tree DNA. This information is publicly available, So I've given you the website there. You can look it up, and there are many features and a lot of information available. I've taken screenshots here and flipped the tree on its side. So we have running down the right-hand side a time scale going from 200 years before present right up to present day. The testers are represented with their country of origin flag. Where you see a question mark, it's because the tester has chosen not to enter the detail of their country of origin or the most distant known ancestor, their country of origin. But starting up in the top right here, we have a tupuna whose name we don't know, but is identified by this mutation or a change, not in a negative sense, on the Y chromosome. And all descendants of this tupuna here have that change, and that on their Y chromosome, and that has allowed them to be placed as descendants of this genetic ancestor who lived almost 2,000 years ago, and probably most likely off the coast of present-day Papua New Guinea, perhaps in the Bismarck Archipelago, possibly even as close as Vanuatu. And we get this information, and we're learning this information as more and more men test. So we can see here that this time tree also integrates results which have been previously published in academic research, including these two results from Ko Iwi, from the remains of tupuna, two in Eretok in Vanuatu and one in Rapa Nui. And so these results, they haven't been able to do comprehensive testing on them, which is why they're not more precisely placed in terms of this Rapa Nui tester. These two other testers, maybe even if they were able to do comprehensive testing, that they would descend on independent lineages, because these testers here are all much more recently related to each other. This group of testers here all descend from this ancestor who lived around 1,200 years ago, and he has descendants, living descendants in present-day Samoa, American Samoa, and some more here in Samoa. And he also has a male lineage with descendants in Hawaii and Cook Islands. So this tupuna here, represented by this code, probably lived in Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, that area, just based on where his descendants live and what we know about migration through the moana from other sources, such as the DNA of animals, plants, languages, the development of languages across the moana. Now looking at this group of descendants who all descend from this ancestor, again, most likely living somewhere in present-day Western Polynesia, but possibly could have been a tupuna who was in present-day Central Eastern Polynesia, possibly. If he wasn't, then certainly his descendants, are all from today islands in Eastern Polynesia. So we have here Marquesas, that's present-day Northern French Polynesia, Society Islands, that's a little bit further south, Austral Islands, that's the southernmost islands of French Polynesia, Rapa Nui, two testers here, Hawaii, and all of these testers here from Aotearoa. And these two ancestors, this tupuna here, who is, or these three men descend from, most likely was a tupuna in Aotearoa. These two may have been tupuna who travelled on waka to Aotearoa. Possibly they could have been in central eastern Polynesia before their descendants left on waka. And we have one third lineage here, and there's testers here from Cook Islands, Marquesas, Hawaii, Tapu Tapu Atia, so that's the marae on Rangiatia, and also there's a tester here referred to, well, not a tester, sorry, these are DNA test results that have been performed on ko iwi, as I mentioned, and these two, Botokudu, 17 and also 15 here, these were actually ko iwi that were found in the Brazilian Museum and had been mislabeled. So there's some research that was published early 2000s speculating on why these ko iwi had, they were believed to be from people in Brazil, indigenous belonging to an indigenous community in Brazil, but they were actually mislabeled ko iwi that had been sent from the Dominion Museum to in Aotearoa, the forerunner of Te Papa, to Brazil. Unfortunately, these ko iwi were perished in the Great Fire that was in the Brazilian Museum a couple of years ago. But the Y-DNA test results could be integrated, and we can see that according to the records sent registered in the Dominion Museum, it was a Māori and a Moriori tupuna whose skulls were unfortunately sent to the museum in Brazil. So I hope this, looking at this genetic tree of men, allows us to learn something more about ourselves and also our whakapapa. When the men in our whānau test, their results are for all of our whānau, that they represent the tupuna who they descend from and also who we descend from. There's, like I said, there's a lot of information on the website, and including a new feature that's going to be released next week, which is going to animate these results and incorporate the estimated dates and also estimated movement throughout the Pacific. And in showing this information, I don't want to in any way takahi the mana of whānau hapu iwi who have different pūrākau and kōrero tawhito regarding the arrival of their whānau, the arrival of their tupuna in Aotearoa, te ika Māui, te Waipounamu. I'm well aware the DNA test results, they don't stand alone and they don't align always with kōrero tawhito for all iwi, but for some iwi they do, and some of us are, and our whānau are DNA testing and are interested in these topics. And so, the purpose of this talk is to show what information we can learn, some of the information that has already been learnt, and of course it's up to every whānau hapu and iwi to incorporate that information if they're interested in the way that is most mana enhancing and respectful for their respective whānau hapu and iwi. Another lineage that can also be traced is the mitochondrial DNA. All tamariki inherit mitochondrial DNA from their biological mothers. And so this means we all have mitochondrial DNA and all of us can test for it. Like Y-DNA, it focuses just on one line. And in this case, it's the matrilineal line, the mother's line. This test is particularly helpful in for excluding a shared recent ancestor on this line. It's not so as helpful as the Y-DNA test results, in terms of we can't get the same kind of precision of dates of when ancestors were shared, but it is really good for excluding. So if you've got a tester and a match and they've both tested their mitochondrial line and they're trying to work out how they're related, if the mitochondrial lines are different, then at least that's one lineage which you can exclude. You're like, okay, well, we know we're not related on this line. And of course, you have many other lineages, but the more of us who do mitochondrial testing, who have also autosomal tested and work collaboratively with other members in our whānau, the more we can know what were the mitochondrial lines of other tupuna as well. So as with Y-DNA, when you or a relative has tested and you have matches, you know you must be related at somewhere on that mitochondrial line if you share mitochondrial DNA, if you're showing up as a match. It can be harder to use mitochondrial DNA test results because it's a smaller kind of DNA and it changes more slowly. These are some of the reasons why we can't get that same sort of precise detail that we get with the Y-DNA test results. But still, it can be very interesting to learn about our mitochondrial lineages and how we're related, and all lead back to one woman known as Mitochondrial Eve, who also lived around 200,000 years ago. And if you're familiar with the research that discusses Māori being the tupuna of Māori coming from Taiwan, for example, that early research used mitochondrial DNA test results to draw those conclusions. Here's a screenshot from the family tree DNA mitochondrial haplotree. It's much simpler. We don't get the dating, but you can see in the same way these codes, letter and number codes, they represent tupuna, and you can get a sense from the flags, the country of origin flags that the testers have chosen, which tupuna are the descendants for testers throughout the Pacific. And it also, when you have your mitochondrial DNA, there's been a fair amount of academic research published. If you're familiar with the Waido Bar research, the mitochondrial results of some of those tupuna whose kō'i were tested before being repatriated, you can compare it. So there's the tupuna who is referred to as Auntie in that research, and her mitochondrial is known. I'm pretty sure off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure her mitochondrial is B4A1A1C. They were using a slightly different naming system at the time that research was published. You can see here from the country of origin flags, some have chosen this flag. This is intended to be used by testers from the Americas, Turtle Island, but when the country of origin options were initially released, we didn't have flags for the different islands in the Pacific, and so these testers are probably most likely from Hawaii, and they chose these flags because it was the closest that they felt represented them. Now there is the state flag for Hawaii, but not everyone has updated their country of origin flag. The testers with the American flag, again, are most likely from Hawaii. testers from present-day French Polynesia may have previously chosen French flag. Some testers, the country of origin doesn't reflect actually their genetic ancestors, and that may be here, for example, the British flag. That may be because they didn't realise that they had the ancestors from the moana prior to DNA testing, or it may be just that it's not entirely clear when you fill out the information at family tree DNA that it's just that direct maternal line. That is the ancestor that they're asking about when they ask you to select your country of origin. So there's lots more to learn about there, but we don't have time to discuss all of this evening. So I'm just going to hop on now to where to learn more. This list here is a number of genealogists who I've learned from who work with DNA test results from different communities, but all of them are impacted in a similar kind of way by this history of endogamy. So we have genealogists here working with DNA, Jewish DNA test results, Italian, Mexican, Acadian from French-speaking Canada, Cajun from Louisiana. Many of these genealogists are regular bloggers and online speakers. Some also have podcasts or videos on YouTube where you can learn more. They're all worth following, listening to, reading their blogs if you get a chance. I'd like to highlight Leah Larkin in particular, also known as the DNA Geek. Leah has a talk on endogamy that she gives every 6 months or so via Eventbrite, and she's actually giving it early next month. So that's what I wanted to highlight it. The price there is in US dollars, so it works out to be about 35 New Zealand dollars. You can watch the talk live, and you also have access to the replay for 2 weeks after. She gives the talk twice each time she offers it, so you actually get to listen to 2 replays. I have learned so much from Leah and from this talk in particular. I've probably watched about 20 different versions of it over the last 4 years, and she's helped me so much in learning how to understand and get the most out of Māori DNA test results. Leah also runs a Facebook group known as DNA Roundtable. It's a great source of information. Again, you know, there's a variety of different groups on Facebook for learning about DNA that have more or less reliable information. It's really good to know the groups that have reliable information with admins who are onto it on this topic in particular, because if you use the standard research methodology, which may be just suggested to you in a group where people aren't as knowledgeable on this topic, you could just get really tied up in knots. So a few other groups that I'd like to recommend: Using DNA for Genealogy, Australia and New Zealand, New Zealand DNA Users Group, and also DNA Detectives Down Under. So I'm pretty sure you can join all of these groups even if you haven't DNA tested and you're just wanting to learn more. We also have a dedicated group for Māori who've DNA tested. This is just for tangata whenua. As I mentioned when discussing ethnicity estimates earlier, there's other people across the moana who may also be told by the DNA testing companies that they have a percentage of Māori DNA, New Zealand Māori DNA, or are in a genetic group which has been tagged as being Māori, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily are tangata whenua. It takes looking at your DNA matches and also knowing your whakapapa, or if you don't know your whakapapa, at least knowing how to interpret your results, because it could be that your tupuna are actually from the Cook Islands, for example, or present-day French Polynesia or Hawaii. And because in our group we're focused on helping Māori who don't know their whānau and whakapapa, particularly due to adoption or for some other reason, we're just trying to keep it quite focused on helping tangata whenua who have DNA tested. Something in person, if it's possible for you to attend. This is coming up next month, the Auckland Family History Expo. It's free on Saturday and Sunday to attend. On Friday evening, there is an opening event, and that does cost $25 per person. There are limited tickets, and the website for finding out more is there. Also, announcing tonight, the New Zealand, the NZSG Online DNA Interest Group. This is for NZSG members. We're going to run live monthly presentations on Zoom. There will also be supporting Google Classroom, and we're starting next month, Wednesday, the 30th of August at 7 p.m. There'll be more information coming out in the e-kit. So just to summarize the things that we've covered tonight, we've looked at the basics of DNA inheritance, how it is that you can inherit DNA from your tupuna and be matched with other people who have also inherited similar DNA, how we can use that information to learn more about our whakapapa and our whānau, some of the particular challenges of analysing, understanding Māori DNA test results, the workarounds that we can use, and where to learn more. So just a few words of caution before I end. It's really important to be prepared when doing DNA testing. With any DNA testing, it's not uncommon to learn of surprise family members. Perhaps the DNA test results don't support what you know about your whānau and whakapapa, or perhaps they don't support the knowledge that your matches have. So it can be confronting and unsettling, and it's really important to be aware that this is quite common. It pays also to not be in too much of a rush when you're looking at results, and take time to seek out accurate information on how to interpret your results. There's different limitations of DNA test results. DNA test results can only help us answer certain whakapapa questions. They can't answer everything that we may want to know. As I showed earlier with the Y-DNA and mitochondrial test results, we can learn something about the migration across the moana nui a kiwa, but there's also a whole lot that we're just not able to learn about from DNA test results. And lastly, if it isn't obvious, there's heaps to learn, and it can require quite a lot of patience. It can be really overwhelming at times, but if you keep slowly chipping away at it, and hopefully you'll have success and be able to use your DNA test results to answer at least some, if not all, of your questions. Lastly, if it's not already clear, DNA testing isn't a quick and easy route to answering all your whakapapa questions. Often it's portrayed like that, but certainly in my experience and the experience of many other people, it's much more of this kind of a hikoi, where you need to be well prepared if you're going to make it up to the top there. So thanks again for joining me for this talk, and thank you again to NZSG for inviting me. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Elena. That was very, very fascinating. And big clap, Wendy's found the clapping icon. And those of you, if you want to turn your cameras back on, and if you've got any questions for Elena, I know that it's fascinating to see, especially with the Y and the mitochondrial, how you know, how it links up to, you know, can show the migration and the, yeah, just the way people were moving around. That's quite a fascinating part of DNA that people often don't think about or don't ask about. So Michelle has said that she's looking forward to the DNA session on the 30th. So instead of letting me rabbit on, are there any questions for Elena?
I hope I didn't speak too fast, because I
No, I didn't think so at all.
No, it was a lot to get through, and I thought you kept it really, really clear. It was very
yeah,
good.
and that's probably why nobody stuck their hand up to ask a question, is because you've obviously covered off sufficient of what they wanted to know about. I mean, I've found it fascinating because I did some work for someone who the family thought they were part Maori, but using the DNA with, with doing the whakapapa research, which mainly was the European side of the family. I think we're heading fast towards Fiji rather than New Zealand for the grandma. There was an unknown set of grandparents, and it's been quite interesting to sort of step out of my comfort zone and try and see it. But again, there hasn't been anybody near relatives that seem to have tested on that. Probably Fijian. So the European whakapapa takes you into Fiji and then into New Zealand. So, that's my working theory, but I don't have any matches to find the mum, and that's kind of, there's plenty of matches in places far, far away, nothing near. But yeah, I think DNA has probably provided some people with a bit of surprise. I mean, I've spoken to people. I did a presentation once for the staff at the Alexander Turnbull Library, and they were going, there's a lot of people that thought they had Italian in their family, and actually when they do a bit more research or DNA, they discover that no, actually it was Maori, because nobody wanted to admit that, the slightly darker skin was Indigenous. And it's sort of, oh, seriously? But those were the times.
Yeah, the DNA test results can reveal all kinds of information.
Yeah. And sometimes some unwanted information when people aren't what you were expecting. But yeah, they're still a fascinating tool to get into. Well, since we don't have any questions, and I will probably rabbit on for hours, but and I'm sure others will too, I will wrap up and say thank you, Elena, for coming along, and thank you for providing this presentation. It was very interesting, and I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there that will get great value out of it. And when we put the recording up on the website, we'll also put a link in to Elena's other presentations that give a bit more detail on some of the other aspects of using DNA when you have whakapapa out of the moana. Is that what we just used to describe the Pacific?
Yep.
So, yeah, fascinating. So thank you, Elena.